Black. Most painters overthink it. Too many highlights, too many layers, and it ends up grey. Today, I'm testing a less is more approach with just a few paints. No greys, no edge highlights, and absolutely no dry brushing. 4 grimdark miniatures, 4 experiments. Some work, some don't. Let's see what happens. Okay, so I have assembled and primed in Chaos Black 4 Horus Heresy Marines, exactly the same, just in slightly different poses here. And my goal today is to create 4 examples of experimenting and playing around with black to create visually striking and realistic blacks without overthinking it. In this first experiment, I'm going to be going with just pigment powders. Now, if you've watched any of my other videos, you will see that I use pigment powders quite a lot on my bases, specifically oranges and yellows and things like that. I also use pigment powders a lot in my terrain as well. Today, though, I'm going to attempt something completely new. I'm going to be using only powders to paint this miniature. However, I will be throwing in some Typhus Corrosion, which is a technical paint just for some extra texture on this particular miniature. The pigment powders that I've selected here are a black, a sort of mid-browny orange, a lighter orangey rust color, and a yellow as well. And I reiterate, these are all experiments, and I've filmed the entire process here, and what I'm going to do afterwards is go through and critique some of my own work, because I feel like a lot of YouTubers, particularly people that do hobby tutorials and painting videos, don't tend to critique their own work or talk about what they could have done better, what they don't like, and what they do like about their finished miniatures. So hopefully that's really helpful for you, and you don't make some of the mistakes I did here today. I'm making the mistakes so that you don't have to. Now, it's worth mentioning in the first picture that I did use a bit of Typhus Corrosion just on the legs and in some of the sort of deeper recesses to create some texture before I went in with the pigments. This is very messy, by the way, so you're going to want to put down some paper towel just so that you don't ruin your table. Also, I would advise not breathing in too heavily when you're doing this as well, as this stuff's probably not too good for your lungs. But as you can see here, I'm using the black pigment to create a really matte effect on this miniature just by dabbing and splotching and stippling the black pigment into the miniature first and foremost. I'm making sure here to be quite random with it, but also cover any of the recesses where I want build-up of texture and dry, dusty sort of appearance. I find pigment powders are definitely underutilized in Warhammer specifically. You see a lot of people using them in sort of historics or World War II miniature painting a lot more, particularly on vehicles and stuff, but I feel like they're definitely underutilized in terms of Warhammer, and I really want to push the boundaries of what pigments can do here. Okay, the next pigment we're going to be using here is a sort of burnt sienna, so a slightly darker orange than the rusty one that I've got here in front of me. I'm going to be using this a bit more sparingly this time. You can see the black is laid down all over this miniature. In this instance, I'm using this color just in sort of key areas where I want to create some sort of texture and rust build up. I'm then going to add further colors to this, in the recesses particularly, and we'll see how we go. Again, using the same splotching, dabbing, stippling motion here. Pigments are quite hard to control, and I quite like the sort of randomness of that. So the process of applying pigments, you've really got to stuff them into the miniature quite sort of vigorously to be able to get them to actually adhere to the miniature. But we're going to do some other stuff later on, which is going to make them act in a particular way. With the darker sienna color laid down, I'm then going to go in with my brighter orange rusty color and add some sort of highlights, I suppose, over the top of that darker orange, and this is just going to create some sort of volumetric sort of highlights here, just very roughly, and again, the sort of randomness of this is what I'm enjoying here. At this point, I've got no idea how this is actually going to turn out, but having done this on scenery and other larger bits of sort of Warhammer terrain, I'm fairly confident in this process. And finally, moving on to the yellow. This one I'm going to be using the least, and I'm just applying this in sort of sparse areas and again sort of dabbing in some of it. The excess is falling off this miniature onto the table, which is why I've put down the paper towel here. But as you can see, everything looks very, very messy and very random at this point, and you're probably thinking, Damon, this looks terrible. But just wait for it. This one does turn out to be a bit of a banger. Okay, so far we've only really done 3 processes so far, including the actual priming of the miniature, which doesn't really count. We've primed it in Chaos Black. We then went in and we added some Typhus Corrosion just in some key areas to add some extra texture. We then went over with 4 different pigments and we covered the miniature in those to create a dusty, rusty, horrible looking Space Marine. The The next thing I'm going to do, and here's where things get really interesting, is get some odorless mineral spirits and start using this to create a sort of pin wash in some of the areas on this miniature. Now you'll notice that the capillary action of the odorless mineral spirits does move the pigments around in a really random and awesome looking way. This is going to dull down the pigments quite a lot, so as you can see here, when it's dry it looks pretty messy and filthy. What we're going to do though is use the odorless mineral spirits to create a bit of control, still keeping things random, but dull down the overall appearance of the actual pigments and transform them into more of a paint. Now it's very important that I use a different brush here, but you can see just by dipping this in the mineral spirits and adding little dabs of the mineral spirits all over the miniature, it is flooding into the recesses and it's carrying that dry pigment powder into the places that I really want it, and adding more control to the randomness that we had in the beginning. Now the mineral spirits without any use of oil actually dry really fast, and the other thing that you could use if you don't want to use mineral spirits here is isopropyl alcohol. There isn't much difference really with how this actually works. I would say though that the capillary action of the mineral spirits is better for this actual task. So I went and had a cup of tea and a little snack, and I came back and this miniature is virtually dry. How awesome does this look, and how little effort was it to achieve this? Already things are looking awesome. I've done the bolt gun here just by doing a little bit of metal on it just to create some contrast here. I'm not going to go over the top on any of the other details on this miniature though, because again, all we're trying to do here is create some sort of really cool looking black armor. Just look at how the pigments have flooded into the recesses in a random way and created something that looks very realistic and very natural and very worn and rusty as well. However, at this point, I still feel like the miniature doesn't read as black necessarily. It's very dirty black, of course, but I'm going to go back in with some of the black pigment and just stipple it into some of the flatter areas on the miniature, just to create a bit more of a difference, a variation, a contrast between those rusty areas and build back up the black armor that we had. It doesn't take much work here. Really, all I'm doing is a sort of overbrushing / stippling with just the black pigment. Honestly, at this point, things are looking really good, but I'm going to take it just a tiny step further by getting some Corvus black out. Now, this is a wet paint, and I did lie to you in the beginning when I said I'm only going to be using pigment paints. I do feel, however, that the black just isn't quite black enough in the areas that I want it. So what I'm going to do here is stipple on some Corvus black. Now, Corvus black is actually a very dark turquoise, and I think it's the perfect highlight for Chaos Black naturally, and it just adds a really nice matte, sort of awesome looking finish to this miniature. And I'm really just adding this on the sort of highest points, the sort of highlights on the miniature, to allow that rustiness in the recesses and still read more as black when we take photos of it later. It's really important that I don't overdo it at this point, because I don't want to lose that dry matte finish that we've got from the pigments. The main areas of attention are the backpack, the pauldrons, and some of the chest plate, as well as the top of the head here. Other than that though, I'm keeping things pretty loose and minimal with this Corvus black. And there we have it, guys. That was super easy to achieve. Of course, I did go in and add a red eye lens on the helmet here as well, and the bolt gun was done off camera too, but things were very simple there as well, as you can tell. But you can see what you can achieve by using a very different type of product in the pigment powders. Now, if you're afraid of using pigment powders, hopefully this will put that to bed and you can go and experiment with this. But just look at what you can achieve with such little effort. Once I've added the pigment powders to the base as well to create even more contrast between the dark armor and the light base, this miniature is looking awesome. And I can see myself painting up an army of Black Legions, say, or even Heresy Dark Angels or something similar, perhaps even Raven Guard, or any black that you want to do. This is an awesome way of doing it, and honestly, the results speak for themselves, I think. Let me know what you think in the comments. I think this one turned out really good. Okay, so for our next black experiment, we're going to be focusing on a metallic black using contrast paints and a bit of weathering. The 4 paints that I've selected to begin with here are Runefang Steel, which is a very bright silver from Citadel, as well as some Black Templar contrast paint. Then we've got some Banshee Brown from Army Painter as a sort of type of weathering, as well as some Goons Grime from Villainy Inks as well, and you'll see how I use those at the end of this one. Okay, so I'm going to start off by mixing some Runefang steel, this very bright silver, in with some of the Banshee brown and a little bit of water here. I want to create a very bright brownish coppery sort of color, and this we're going to sponge over the whole miniature using a makeup sponge to create some really high contrast metallic armor. Now I've dampened the makeup sponge a little and I'm using the sort of teardrop shape of it on the end just to be able to get into some of those deeper recesses, just so that we've covered this thing. Of course, the very deep recesses and underneath from the bottom is going to be black, and the very top is going to be this sort of coppery color that we're going over with now. Now you can be a bit heavy-handed here, and obviously the softer you go with the makeup sponge, the smoother the finish is. However, I actually like to be quite heavy-handed because it creates more visual texture on the miniature, and again, I think black needs more texture to really look awesome on the table. So with our miniature looking very bright and contrasty indeed, the next thing we're going to hit it with is a contrast paint, and in this case we're going to be using Black Templar. This is the standard Citadel contrast paint for black, really. There are some other blacks in there as well, but I'd say Black Templar is the one that you're going to be using most of the time. And we're going to coat this liberally all over the armor, slapping it over every single nook and cranny that we have here. With that first layer of Black Templar done, I still feel like things read as gunmetal rather than actual black, so we're going to go in with another layer of Black Templar. Now you might think this is going to be too dark, but we are playing with black here. Don't overthink it. We don't want things to read as metal or grey in any way. We want things to read as black, and that's exactly what I'm going to go over with another coat of Black Templar. While the second coat of Black Templar was drying, I went in and added some texture paint to the base of this miniature, ready for later's basing. And then I went back to my Runefang steel to add some sort of little tiny pinpoint highlights all over this miniature. Now, what I will say is that if you get a miniature that's this dark and you can break it up with just some little tiny pinpricks of detail, things start really popping and looking very awesome. So what I've done here is I've gone over every single little rivet and every sort of high point on the miniature with this brightest of silvers. So here's our finished miniature. This one was super easy to achieve as well, and I think it reads as pretty damn black. Now this is the shiniest of the blacks that I've done. I didn't want any sort of matteness to it really at all, because the idea here was that it was going to be a metallic black. I could have possibly reduced the amount of Black Templar that I added to this, maybe watered down the second layer, but I'm pretty happy with things overall. If I was to critique it and do things slightly differently, I would say that actually I wouldn't do every single rivet on this. I would just do some of the uppermost rivets on the model with that bright Runefang steel. I don't think that you should overdo it when adding these very high contrast little highlights. Again though, it's very easy to achieve, and this is actually the same recipe that I did on one of my Spire Hunters for Necromunda scene here as well. However, I feel like this guy actually turned out looking better because I was slightly more minimalist with the highlights of the Runefang steel on this. So food for thought there. And again, this was super easy to achieve. Anybody could do this, and the contrast on the base again just makes things pop a little bit more and things look pretty damn good if you ask me. Again though, let me know what you think in the comments on this one as well. Personally, the first one is still my favorite. On to our third Space Marine. Now this one I'm going to be using some interesting products that you may not have seen in many hobby tutorials so far, most notably something called Newsh. Now this Newsh is a revolutionary product. It is an acrylic medium, and what it does exactly is you mix it with any acrylic paint and it slows down the drying time colossally, meaning that you can use it with the reductive technique that you'd be familiar with oils, and you can add recesses and different tones to a miniature and play around with it to your heart's content before it actually dries. Layers and layers and layers. You could really go to town with Newsh, and the options really are limitless with this. The only thing I would say with Newsh is it doesn't have the capillary action that you're going to get out of using oils, so it's worth considering that here. This is the first time that I'm actually using Newsh on a miniature properly, so we'll see what we can get out of it here. But the paints that I've chosen to use here is a Dryad Bark. We've got a model color, sort of rusty orange here as well. Corvus Black here, which was my favorite black, that very dark turquoise sort of highlight that I talked about earlier. Now, for those of you that saw my Adepta Sororitas Sisters that I did for Kill Team that were featured on the Warhammer community website, you can go and check that out if you haven't already. A lot of people ask me how I did the armor for that, and this is the closest thing to it. Of course, this step here is actually how I achieved that armor, and it's very, very simple indeed. All I used was a Chaos Black spray, and then I went in and stippled some of that Corvus Black onto the highermost points of the armor, and that was it. Unfortunately, I did lose half of the footage for the sisters video, so I ended up not being able to do a tutorial on that, so I've thrown that in here for you today. This is really simple. We're just using Corvus Black in a random stippling motion to create some sort of volumes and interesting textures on this miniature, and a sort of foundational highlight, I suppose, before we go on to the next step. Okay, with that Corvus Black now done, we're now going to go in and use the Newsh. I'm going to use a couple of drops of the Newsh out of the bottle. It looks like PVA glue, which is quite alarming, but then we mix in different colors with it and we create a very, very slow drying time acrylic paint. I'm starting off with darker colors and I'm moving up to lighter colors as I go. With this brown Newsh mixture, I am slapping it on in quite random and rough motions to get it into the deepest recesses of this model to build up some dirt and grime. Then I go in with a damp makeup sponge, a clean one by the way, and just remove some of the surface layer on this. Now you want to be quite light-handed because you don't want to sort of abrase the, is that a word? Abrase? You don't want to be abrasive to the layer underneath. So this is really just smearing and wiping the sort of like brown mixture in the Newsh that we've got, and just taking it off some of the raised areas and letting it settle into those recesses. Okay, so next up we're going to move up in color to a sort of orangey brown from Army Painter here as well. I can't remember the name of the paint, but it is in one of the John Blanche sets. We're then going to apply this slightly less chaotically, I suppose, just in some of those areas that I really want it to be. To be honest though, again, you can be fairly heavy-handed with this because again, the slow drying time of the Newsh allows you to remove it to your heart's content. Once I've removed the excess with the makeup sponge, again, I am then applying little tiny dots of the brightest orange here. This is going to act as the sort of true rust on the miniature, and we're adding that to all of the rivets and all of the areas where I think realistically dust when rust would build up. With our Newsh paints added to this miniature, things are actually looking very similar, certainly in color, to the original miniature that I did with the pigment powders. However, what we have instead is a much less matte finish. This miniature is still a little bit shiny, and I feel like it's still a bit close, at least in color, to that first miniature. So what I'm going to do here is something a bit different and add some weathering via a ripped up piece of sponge and some Iron Warriors to create a little bit of metal weathering through this armor. I don't want to go over the top with this either, but I just feel like it's going to add something different to this miniature if we go for a slightly more metallic detail. With the addition of the metallic weathering all over this miniature, we're then going to go in with some Villainy Inks Goons Grime. Now this stuff is flipping awesome. It is not an oil wash, I believe it's an enamel wash, and it is very similar in sort of color to one of the streaking grimes as well. However, it does act slightly differently in that it doesn't sort of stain the color underneath too much. You do need to use some odorless mineral spirits with this as well to actually remove it in the reductive process, but this is a flippin' awesome product and it flows a bit more. It's a little bit wetter than say a streaking grime, so it's a good alternative for an oil wash or a streaking grime or whatever you're used to in terms of using your sort of final weathering processes. So just like you would with a streaking grime or an oil wash, I'm using an old dirty brush here and I'm just dabbing and splotching this into all of the areas, particularly the recesses on this miniature. Now you can wait for a while for this to dry somewhat before you go on to the next process, but I'm impatient and I don't really care too much. Plus, I don't want too much buildup of color on this either. So what I'm going to do is go straight in with a Q-tip dipped in some mineral spirits, and I'm going to remove the sort of top layer of the paint on this miniature. The Goons Grime, as you can see, is coming off and it's settling into the recesses of this miniature, allowing us some really nice contrast and something a little bit different to the first Space Marine that we did with the pigment powders as well, in that the finish will look very, very grimy and dirty compared to that one. And there we have it. The Goons Grime in combination with the sort of stippled bits of metal on this one lead into a slightly different aesthetic. I feel like the armor looks very, very hard and solid indeed as a result, and things are looking really nice. Do I like it as much as the pigment one? I don't think I do, but it adds something different to the mix here. And so far, all three of these miniatures I'm really, really happy with. And again, The process is very, very simple here, as you've seen. Not many products used, but I do feel in retrospect that I could go a bit further with the Newsh, maybe go with some even higher contrast, maybe some greens, some sort of oxidization perhaps on this one, with some sort of turquoisey greens in there perhaps as well, or even some different sort of inks and washes as well, maybe some reds in there, some pinks too. But again, we're not overthinking it too much. We're just sticking with this, and we're going to stop when we feel things are done. And I'm pretty happy with this one as well. Let me know what you think about this one in the comments too. This is our Newsh Marine. Okay, so with all of my videos, with the whole less is more sort of philosophy, what I'm trying to do here is show you that less is more, but also that you just don't have to overthink things or overcook things too much. But it does happen, and in this instance, I did exactly that. I went too far with it, and I'm going to show you why and how that actually happened, and that I added one extra process in here that if I'd have kept out, this miniature actually would have looked pretty good. I feel like a lot of channels don't include their mistakes and some of the stuff that they would do better next time. So I thought I'd throw this one into the video instead of making it 3. I'm keeping the original 4 of these Space Marines here. I'm going to show you where I went wrong with this one, because it could have ended up quite good. Sadly, it really didn't. But again, this is to show you that you do make mistakes, and it's absolutely fine to do that. We just repaint the miniature, or we just do it differently next time. So this one was a bit more scientific. I went with a chromatic black scheme here. Now, what I mean by that is that basically all of the black that you see on Earth, even in shadows, on clothing, on items that are otherwise known as black, they're not really black. There's no absence of color unless you're in the void of space, I believe. So pretty much every black that we see with our eyes has some sort of color in it, even if it's very, very, very dark. So what I was going to achieve here is a chromatic black, starting with mixing very dark paints together. Now I've got 3 paints in front of me here. We've got Blanched Berry, which is a very dark sort of purpley sort of claret color. We've also got Blighted Green, which is a very dark, colder sort of green from the John Blanche set. We've also got one of the Darkness as well, which is a very, very dark navy blue. So using this very dark purpley blue, we're going to hit all of the underneath layers, the areas that aren't going to be hit by the light, basically. So any of the sort of extra dark shadows on this miniature, I'm going to hit with this color. So underneath the pauldrons, underneath the legs, underneath the butt, underneath the crotch, underneath the bolter, underneath the arms, etc. You get where I'm going with this. Then I'm going to do a 50-50 mix of the Darkness and Blighted Green. This is a greener, slightly colder look than the warmer color that we went for on the underpainting, and this is going to be directly opposite that. It's going to be hitting the miniature on all the above surfaces, all the areas that we're going to see from above, so the opposite of the process that we just went through. With those 2 layers of paint down on the miniature, things are looking pretty bland at this point, so I'm going to add an extra level of depth with an oil wash here. So what I'm going to be using is an oil wash. We're going to use odorless mineral spirits and one of my oil paints here as well. Of course, we're doing black armor, so you need to use a black oil paint here. The thing about oil washes is they are flipping awesome for creating extra depth to a miniature. They flow into all of the recesses nicely, and they leave a matte finish. Creating a very watery wash here, we're then going to splotch this all over the miniature and then hit it with another Q-tip, removing any of that excess oil on the raised areas of the miniature. So here, right here is where I go wrong, guys. Now I could have left it here and just maybe done some Corvus Black on it or something else, or maybe just added a little bit of rust to it or something like that. However, I went a bit too far and I got out the streak and grime. Now this particular streak and grime is quite green, and what I didn't realize is that I'd ordered the wrong color. And when I took this out of the pot, I wasn't really looking at it too well because my lighting is terrible. And I didn't realize how much of a green we actually had here. So as soon as I started adding it to the miniature, I realized that I was creating a very, very dark green shadow in all of the recesses, but it was lighter than the sort of darker colors on the miniature already, and that things weren't really working out how I'd hoped. When it came to removing the streak and grime, which I did get onto quite swiftly, I found that it wasn't really removing enough of the paint, and because I hadn't varnished this miniature prior to this, it was staining the colors underneath far too much. What we ended up with was a green miniature. It just doesn't read as black, and that was my problem here. The streaking grime was a step too far, and what I should have done is stopped earlier, left the oil wash to do its thing, and maybe just added some spot highlights to this miniature to avoid this from happening. Now, it doesn't look bad necessarily, but for me, it just doesn't read as black, and I can see in my head the idea that I had going probably would have turned out okay with the sort of chromatic style, but again, let me know what you think, guys. I'm glad I included this process to show you that I do make mistakes and that everybody can make mistakes and learn from them. That's the best way that we learn, especially with painting and stuff like this. Experiment, do not fear, try things out. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. In this case, it didn't. But there you have it, 4 grimdark Space Marines in black armor, easy to achieve, very quick, very simple, and looking decent on your table. I do, however, feel that the first one, the pigment one, was the most rewarding because I really didn't expect to get the great results that I got from it. I do really like the other two as well, specifically the Newsh one I think came out really well with that armor looking really hard and really solid. I hope this experiment gave you some food for thought on blacks in miniature painting, because I do feel that a lot of people overcook it. They end up doing edge highlights in either grey or blue, and the miniature does not read as black. It's very rare that I see black miniatures actually reading as black and actually looking like black on the table. I could spend forever edge highlighting or dry brushing a miniature, but it just doesn't look black enough for me. So what I've done is I've put this together for you and shown you just how simple it can be to achieve really great black armor results. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below, and I'll be back with another video real soon. Peace out.